Witness this unbelievable, true inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The town of Mercy's Hollow sat like a weathered tooth on the wide, sun-baked plain. A handful of wooden storefronts, a saloon with a sagging balcony, a church steeple that cast a thin shadow at noon. Dust rode the wind in slow, lazy spirals. The year was the kind that split time into before and after, not by calendars, but by the marks people left on one another. Folks in Mercy's Hollow believed the land answered to those who listened and punished those who didn't. They believed in hard work and harder silences. They also believed in shows. Small, bright eruptions of laughter and music against the long, patient quiet. The harvest jubilee that autumn promised one such eruption. Cider steamed and skins of apples glinted on tables. Children chased one another with crowns of corn silk. The festival's main attraction, the bride's play, was a tradition that came from nowhere and everywhere. A mock auction where volunteers, usually the young women who worked at the boarding house, or the preacher's widowed sister, dressed in thrifted gowns and offered their company in staged courtship to raise money for Mercy's Hollow. School. Clara Beauregard walked into the Jubilee as she did everything, without asking permission. She was a tower of a woman, 6'2", with shoulders that had shouldered storms, and hands that could mend fences and hearts in the same motion. Her hair was a dark tumble, usually tied back with a strip of leather. Today it was braided and pinned with a white ribbon, a mockery of the dainty things the other girls wore. The dress she'd found at the boarding house chest was moth whisper thin and the color of old cream. It clung to her in a way that made people look, not in disgust, but in a stunned, slow admiration, as if some living thing had suddenly caught the light. They called her the giant bride, half in affection, half in prophecy. Clara had a laugh like a bell and a gait like a mare stepping into water, deliberate, certain. She worked the winter wheat and fixed the mill's broken gears in summer. She read by lantern when the night turned too cold for sleep. Townsfolk said she could lift a plough by herself, could calm a skittish colt with one look. Men respected her hands, and women admired the way she wore a belt. No one expected her to step forward onto the Jubilee platform in a borrowed dress and take the microphone. When she did, she let the silence swell like a held breath. The auctioneer, Billy Lorne, who thought himself the beating heart of every small event, cleared his throat, set his hat at an angle, and began the usual banter. Laughter and jest rolled across the square, like pebbles on glass. Bids came quick and bright, a tin of good coffee, a skein of wool, half a day's haul from the mill. The act was levity, the money was charity. That was Mercy's Hollow law, unwritten and sacred. A stranger sat at the back on a rough-hewn bench watching. He'd come in on a freight wagon a month past, hung his hat at the livery, and set up shop in a clapboard shed on the edge of town that smelled of oil and secrets. Thomas Reed was not a man people forgot. His jaw carried stories. His hands were stained with grease and ink. He kept ledgers of the rail crews and lingered too long at the edge of conversations. He bid for nothing. He fixed, he listened, and sometimes late at night, he walked the rutted roads outside Mercy's Hollow as if seeking something his maps could not name. That afternoon, when the moment came, Thomas raised his hand. $5, he called, and the square looked at him as if he'd said a prayer backward. Then he doubled it. Then he doubled it again. He kept going until he'd outbid a half-dozen familiar faces. People began to clap and hoot. Faces blurred into a tide. When the hammer sounded, a wooden rap that made small children jump, Clara had been bought not with the coin typical of the jest, but with a sum that made folks murmur the equivalent, some said of a month's wages. She pivoted beneath the light, the dress hanging like a question. Then she leaned into the microphone, the corner of her mouth catching, and said plainly, loud enough that the wind could take it to the prairie beyond, "You paid for me, so I'm taking it off." A hush, then laughter, the sort that starts as a ripple and becomes a flood. Someone whooped, and someone else spat on the ground to ward off trouble. But Clara's grin stayed, wide, confident, and oddly gentle. She stooped, unfastened the top of the dress, not ripping it anew, but with the calm of a woman who has removed bandages after the wound has healed, and slid the thing off like she was shrugging out of a memory. Beneath, she wore trousers, boots, and a vest patched with the faint marks of work. There was no scandal in this. There was an unveiling. She walked down the platform, the hem of the dress pooling like a white cloud behind her, and she crossed to the bench where Thomas sat. She knelt on one knee in front of him, the way a gambler might lay down his hand, and looked him square in the eye, voice low and wry. "Name's Clara, what's yours?" The audience laughed louder, this time in the relief born of surprise and curiosity. Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it, and the small private change that passed between them was the sort that made small towns take notice. He took his hat off, placed it gently on his lap like a man about to receive a debt in coin. "Thomas Reed," he said. There was steadiness there, a string pulled taut. Clara felt the pull and did not resist. What happened that night should have been nothing more than two honest folks sharing cider beneath festoon lights. Another story the Jubilee would tell next year while the cotillion did its business. But Mercy's Hollow had the habit of turning small moments into the shapes of destinies. Clara and Thomas exchanged words that fit them like gloves. They spoke of the land and of places beyond the map, of a father who'd left a house for a debt and a mother who had held her children like a promise, of engines that sang like iron whales and of harvests that came late. They found in one another a metric of loneliness translated into company. By the time the moon hung fat and white, Clara had told him about the night she chose the plains over the parlour, how she'd borrowed money to buy the first mule and paid it back with sweat. Thomas confessed to nights counting ties and tracks, to wandering rails that led nowhere and everywhere. Laughter softened their confessions. Silence made them more honest. The crowd thinned, leaving only a handful of lanterns and two people who stood in a kind of new arithmetic, 1 + 1 changing its rules. In the days that followed, Thomas did not leave. He found reasons, simple, necessary, to stay. He offered a wrench when the mill's pulley jammed. He read to the kids at the school when the teacher fell ill. He sat across from Clara at the meal table, bringing with him an ease that asked for little and gave much. Mercy's Hollow watched. They watched the way Clara's shoulders relaxed when Thomas returned from his ledger work, the way her hands lingered just a shade longer on his sleeve when helping him from a chair. Even the town's gossip softened into something reverent, as if two people building something were a sacrament. Rumors, though, are the town's weather. Some said Thomas had money hidden in a trunk, cash that could buy a half-dozen farms and a quiet life in a city with brick streets. Others muttered that he'd come to buy land, to bend Mercy's Hollow to his ledger. There was truth and untruth braided together like roots underground. Clara, for her part, paid it no mind. But she was not naive. She had a history with promises that looked like solid things until they crumbled. One night, when frost had begun to parch the edges of the fields and the harvest stores closed their shutters, Thomas and Clara walked the ridge that overlooked the town. The air bit at their noses. Breath showed white like small flags. The town lay below them, lamps caught in windows, the church's bell a dark tooth in the square. Thomas halted and turned to her, hands deep in coat pockets. There was a seriousness to him that was not calculation, but intention. "I didn't come to buy your kindness," he said, voice the low kind that admits to knowing better. "I came because I was tired of being a stranger. Mercy's Hollow keeps a kind of truth I can't find in ledgers. I thought I could fix things with money, Clara. Turns out the things worth fixing are people." Clara thought of the dress she'd shed on the platform, how it had been a costume, and then a dare. She thought of the way he'd watched her work the mill, with admiration braided into it, and of the way he had never flinched when she carried logs twice his size. She reached out, stole his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Then stay and fix that," she said. And the light around them seemed to nod, as if approving. They married in winter, not because the sky demanded it, but because the town decided that two people who had chosen one another deserved a day that held them in the center. The preacher was the same who had married Clara's mother years before. He stumbled over his prayers and then found them again, as if each blessing needed to be discovered anew. The whole town came, bringing pies and quilts and a choiring of voices that made the church seem like it had more souls than doors. Clara wore the dress she had shed at the Jubilee, sewn with care into a new shape, no longer a costume, but an emblem of a life reconfigured. Thomas wore his best jacket, which had seen better trains and worse winters. He kept his ledger jarred away, used now only for receipts and the town's small bookkeeping. The miracle, if there was one, did not arrive as fireworks or riches. It arrived as ordinary things, made luminous by fidelity. Thomas mending the mill's broken cog at dawn so the harvest could be ground. Clara teaching the preacher's widow how to read the new catalogue that came to town. Their nights spent on the porch while the wind rehearsed its songs, trading stories until the horizon melted into the promise of morning. They argued too, how could they not? Over the simplest matters, whether to buy a new plough, which road to mend first, whether to take the boy to the market that Saturday or wait until the sleigh could cross. Their arguments were sometimes storms, sometimes sparks, but they always ended in the same way. Hands found one another, and the two of them laughed. A private language. Years later, people would tell the story of the giant bride as if it were a fable handed down on warm nights. They would tell of the woman who declared, with the certainty of a bell, that she would no longer perform someone else's idea of what she ought to be. They would say Thomas had bought nothing but a ticket to Noahart, and had, in paying, found himself seated at the same table with destiny. Children would point at the porch and ask whether Clara still wore the dress that had started it all. Old men would tip their hats and say that Mercy's Hollow had been right to hold the Jubilee, for that's where the seams of ordinary life split and new shapes emerged, and yet the truth, which is rarely neat or sensational, remained simple and stubborn. Neither the dress nor the money had forged the marriage. The money paid for a laugh and a story. The dress was a coat removed in trust. What built a life was the work they did after the stage lights fell. Mornings of bread kneaded and engines oiled. Nights of listening when one was tired and the other had to carry the light. It was the small, repeated mercies. Answering the door in the storm, sharing the last cup of coffee, remembering the names of neighbors' children. These were the inventions that turned a town into home. On clear evenings, the Jubilee lanterns would be strung once more, and people would gather, older now, with children at their knees. Thomas would stand a little straighter, his hands rougher with years, while Clara laughed loud and long, the sound clear as the bell that called them to supper. They would tell new tales of a colt broken, a harvest spared, and sometimes when the crowd grew quiet, Clara would stand and tell the story of the day she took off the dress. "You paid for me," she would say, a voice catching with the memory, "and I took it off." She would look at Thomas then, and when he met her eyes, he would nod with the humility of a man who had been given a town and found his anchor within it. "But the rest," she'd add, "we made together."